Sounds good.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio while we're on Saga 960. So COP26 wrapped up a couple of weeks ago, and I wanted to reach out to Chris Keefer, who is the president of Canadians for Nuclear Energy. In addition, he is the staff emergency physician at St. Joseph's Health Centre. He's a lecturer at the Department of Family and Community Medicine at the University of Toronto, and he's got a podcast that he might tell us a little bit about as well that he's trying to influence policy. But he was out in Glasgow at COP26 representing Canadians for Nuclear Energy, and he wants to persuade us that nuclear energy is our solution. Chris Keefer, Dr. Chris Keefer, welcome to our show. How are you, sir?
Brian, it's a pleasure to be on, and thank you for having me. I'm doing really well. Thanks for asking.
So how was Glasgow?
Glasgow's an amazing place and a very kind of poetic place to host a climate conference. It is, has a strong industrial history, and it's the birthplace of a famous gentleman named James Watt. That unit of energy, you've probably heard of the watt, the kilowatt, etc.
He came from Glasgow.
So this is a guy. Yeah, and this is a guy who basically took the steam engine and made it incredibly efficient, unleashing the Industrial Revolution, which of course, unleashed a lot of progress. We've seen standards of living, really improve around the world. Metrics that I care about, like child mortality and just lifespan, have really increased as a result. But of course, there's the side effect now of climate change we have to deal with. And it was really his machine that led to the beginning of these carbon emissions that have started to throw off the heat balance of our planet. So it was a poetic place for COP26 to be occurring at. And yeah, a very interesting event. About 20,000 attendees from, of course, governments.
20,000 attendees.
Yeah, in total, yeah. So, I mean, this is spanned between several zones. So there's a green zone, which is more of a civil society, even protest zone. And then there's a blue zone where I was granted access for media, select NGOs, and of course, the politicians that are deliberating on how to deal with the problem of global warming.
And you were there representing the Canadians for Nuclear Energy. Tell me a little bit about that organization and what your point of view is.
Yeah, so Canadians for Nuclear Energy, we're coming up on our second birthday in December. We're a group of, well, I'm a doctor. We have engineers, we have energy analysts and specialists, people that are concerned about labor, health, climate, environmentalists. And we're an all volunteer group. So we're not really a kind of professionalized NGO. We have a not-for-profit status, but we're all volunteer. And, we think it's kind of funny that we have to exist because, if you look at the evidence, if you look at the scientific consensus, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is really looked towards as the preeminent authority on climate change and how to respond to it, they have these decarbonization pathways, which tell us, what's the way forward to decarbonize. And all four of their principal pathways call for an increase in nuclear energy. So it's a very interesting topic. There's a real scientific consensus on the need for it to address climate change, but it's a taboo subject that is terribly misunderstood, which is why we've come together as an organization of advocates to talk about it and really to say that this is a keystone tool, particularly for Canada, to make its contribution and to address the climate crisis.
Taboo because of the issue of nuclear waste?
I mean, there's a number of reasons, but yes, that's certainly one of them, and we can deep dive that if you like.
Canada, at least Ontario, I understand, is one of the largest users of nuclear energy. Is that not correct?
Absolutely, yeah. So most people don't know this, but Ontario has a world-class, deeply decarbonized grid. It's what the whole world is trying to do, at least with electricity so far, is get down to ultra-low emissions. And we've done that. And, we've actually accomplished the greatest greenhouse gas reduction in North American history right here in Ontario with a nuclear-powered coal phase-out. So, I'm not sure if you remember this. I certainly do. Toronto was the big smoke. We had 53 smog days a year. We used to burn a lot of coal for our electricity. About 25% of the grid was made up by coal. And by firing up 6 Canada reactors, we were able to replace that coal, drastically improving our air quality, right? We don't really have smog days anymore. And again, accomplishing North America's greatest greenhouse gas reduction measure. Ontario's emissions decreased as Alberta's increased with the tar sands, but you can really look at that contribution of nuclear in Ontario as being responsible for probably the majority of Canada's progress on emissions reduction. So this is a hugely misunderstood area And I only became aware of this 2 or 3 years ago. And so it's something that I've become quite passionate about as I look for the evidence-based solutions to how we can respond to climate change, as the father of a beautiful 3-year-old who will be hopefully 80 in 2100 in a world that's going to be 2 to 3 degrees hotter, probably.
We're chatting tonight with Chris Keefer. He is a emergency room physician. He's president of Canadians for Nuclear Energy. He's talking about COP26. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just a minute. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Chris Keefer, Dr. Chris Keefer. He's an emergency room physician, but more importantly for today's conversation, he is the president of an organization, an NGO called Canadians for Nuclear Energy. Chris, why would a doctor, a physician, become so interested in and excited about nuclear energy?
I'd say there's two major reasons, but the principal one, especially because you asked an emergency physician, I think the underlying rubric of emergency medicine is this idea of triage. How do you match the limited resources that you have to have the greatest impact and do the greatest benefit for the patients in front of you? And, I've always been a social activist throughout my life, before and during medicine. I've been a staff physician at the Canadian Centre for Victims of Torture. I founded a migrant worker health clinic when I was based down in Brantford near Simcoe, Ontario, to serve the needs of Jamaican and Mexican migrant workers. I have a long history of social activism. And, through this triage ethic, I'm always looking at how I can pair my internal resources with the biggest problems that we face. And again, around the time of the birth of my 3-year-old son, I started thinking a lot about what kind of world I was bringing him into. And the problem of climate change really loomed large. So I started investigating the topic a lot, and particularly investigating the solutions. And again, looking around at the evidence, we have examples now. The evidence is in on which technologies have been successful at rapid and deep decarbonization, and which technologies have been less successful. And so based upon that, looking at the evidence, that's how I arrived at becoming such a passionate advocate for a technology. Again, I mentioned some of those former social justice activities I've been involved with. You asked if I was, you asked myself 10 years ago whether they would have imagined me doing what I'm doing now. They really would have shook their head. They might even have been angry, but here I am.
Okay, so let's take it off the top. What about the issue of nuclear waste? What about the issue of explosions? We've had a couple of examples of nuclear power plants in Japan and the United States that have had some issues. Safety. How do you explain all that?
All right, well, let's take them one by one. So the waste issue is very interesting, right? I always think it's interesting how we have certain degrees of optimism and pessimism towards different technological problems. So, in terms of the stored civilian nuclear waste in Canada, over 60 years of nuclear waste, right? That volume of waste fits inside one hockey rink stacked 1 telephone pole high. Right. So because uranium is so incredibly energy dense, 3 million times more so than coal, it produces 3 million times less waste. And that actually makes it possible for all of that waste to be stored on site up until now at our power plants. Right. I just referenced that volume. It fit inside a Costco, basically. In the history of stored civilian nuclear waste, not just in Canada, but around the world, there's not been a single death as a result. Waste fresh out of a reactor is very dangerous, but we understand how to shield and contain it very well, and we've done so successfully. And that entire waste stream has been successfully contained without any harm to human beings, right? So we've made a bit of a mountain out of a molehill here. Now you'll hear, okay, but this waste is going to be radioactive for a long time, maybe even tens of thousands of years, right? And so the question comes, okay, we've done a great job of storing it so far, but what about into the future? And there's two solutions that we have. One is a new generation of reactors, several of which are already operating in Russia, which are able to burn up a lot of the waste products and the unused energy that remains in that waste, which some people call spent nuclear fuel. So about 95% of the uranium in that fuel we're not actually able to harness it with our current generation of reactors. So that's really exciting. This stuff is actually a resource, not a waste. But if we do want to get rid of it permanently, we have something called deep geologic repositories, right? Where we bury it deep underground in a geology that we understand very, very well its behavior. And, something that really flipped my script or got me really thinking about this in a different way was talking to a number of experts, a geologist who was explaining that the rock formation that we're looking at here in Ontario and South Bruce, The water moves through that rock. It takes 1,000,000 years for it to move 1 meter. So you have to ask yourself, like, what is the mechanism for this waste to get out and harm people, get into the water, get into the biosphere, right? We're putting it very deep in the ground, hundreds of meters below the water table. And that water needs to percolate through all of the artificial barriers we put in place. And it needs to dissolve a ceramic, right? Because the fuel pellets are a ceramic. It essentially needs to dissolve a cup, and then those radionuclides need to be carried somewhere by the water where it can hurt people. But it takes 1,000,000 years for water to percolate through that rock. So even though these are long-lived radioisotopes, it's a problem that's immensely solvable. I mean, human beings are great engineers and problem solvers. We have the solutions to that form of storage. What I'll argue is that we really don't have the solutions and are unlikely to ever have the solutions to building an energy system based primarily on wind and solar, where we need to store enormous amounts of electricity. So there's this kind of paradox in terms of optimism and pessimism about technologies. But the waste issue, let's face it, it's been leveraged by anti-nuclear activists to try and say that we can't do nuclear energy because we have no solutions. I've told you two, I think they're very compelling.
Okay, what about Chernobyl and what was it, 3 Mile Island and
Fukushima,
Japan?
So actually, one of my side gigs in medical education, one of my academic activities is medical simulation, right? And so we practice lots of different scenarios, the human factors, the communications, how to organize our working environment to make it as safe as possible, because healthcare is also a very dangerous environment. It's high stakes, sick people, judgments that need to be made really quickly. We actually draw upon a lot of that safety culture from both aviation and the nuclear industry. So, when you talk about nuclear energy, it's a little bit like aviation and flying. More people have died as a consequence of aviation accidents than have been hurt by nuclear accidents. And we've learned from each of those accidents. That's how we look at it. We recognize that jet air travel is the most effective way to travel quickly to another destination. Similarly, nuclear is the most effective way to achieve deep decarbonization. Chernobyl, I kind of refer to it as the Hindenburg piloted by the crew from Jackass, right? So this was a reactor type that's quite old. We've learned a lot since then in terms of reactor design. And the Soviet system was one in which you never admitted a mistake, and you didn't share anything between the different power plants in terms of lessons learned. So a huge part of nuclear safety, just like medicine and just like aviation, is the human factors element. And we've learned from each of these accidents. You mentioned 3 Mile Island. That was an industrial accident. It was a boondoggle financially, right? Because they just built this reactor and it melted down. 0 people died from radiation as a consequence. The highest dose that a member of the public received from 3 Mile Island was equivalent of 1 chest x-ray, which is completely insignificant. Fukushima, I think, it really illustrates just how safe nuclear energy is. You had, I think it's the 9th largest earthquake ever measured, an enormous wall of water that submerged this nuclear plant. It caused 3 simultaneous meltdowns. And, people are confused about the consequences of that on health. 30,000 people died, but it was because of the tsunami. 0 people died as a consequence of radiation. And that is, very backed up by the best science in the form of the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation. So we have great evidence. We understand radiation. We've studied it more than just about any other phenomena. And, there have been accidents just like there have been in aviation, but we've learned a lot from them. Importantly, in Canada, we've never had a significant nuclear accident. No one has ever been injured. And our reactors are inherently very safe based upon their design, which is something that Canadians should take a huge amount of comfort, but also pride in.
Okay, so let's switch to the positive. We used to federally own a nuclear power company. We've sold it off to the private sector. And we had a different kind of technology using heavy water. Does that give us a huge advantage, or is it an advantage that we squandered?
So you're partially right there. We sold the IP for CANDU for $15 million to SNC-Lavalin. I think that is scandalous. This represented a huge public investment and a huge legacy of Canada. That was a mistake. Our power plants are still all publicly owned by Crown corporations like Ontario Power Generation or New Brunswick Power. And
Bruce Power. I thought Bruce Power owned.
So Bruce Power is a public-private partnership. So the facility is owned by OPG, but it's operated by a private company, which interestingly is owned almost half by a municipal workers' pension fund. Patient private capital works very well with nuclear energy. But in any case, why is CANDU and that heavy water design so good for Canada? Well, it's because we invented it and because the supply chain exists here in Canada. It's 96% based in Canada. So every dollar that we spend on nuclear energy, on CANDU, stays in our economy. It stimulates amazing jobs in the trades, pipe fitters, boiler makers, welders, machinists, millwrights, et cetera, as well as really great STEM jobs. And so it supports a very lively economy. 76,000 Canadians are employed in this sector, again, with great jobs in intergenerational jobs as well, right? Some of these power plants, like Bruce Power, is going to be going probably with the refurbishments. It'll probably hit its 87th birthday with the refurbishments that are being planned. So, I was up there with a labor group visiting the plant, and it's just amazing seeing how prosperous and healthy these communities are. So by using our own technology with our own supply chains, we can accomplish a lot. And that stands in sharp contrast to the alternatives that we have, such as wind and solar, where they're almost all built overseas. The IP for the fancy stuff in the wind turbines comes from Germany and Denmark. The towers are rolled steel, mostly made in Vietnam now. And, our solar panels are mostly made in China, and there's credible allegations of forced labor within that supply chain. And so we can have something that provides permanent intergenerational employment that's 96% made in Canada, or we can have jobs, that are transient, putting up foreign made wind turbines and solar panels every 20 or 30 years. There's a real stark choice to be made here. And nuclear, again, there's evidence that it works. We've accomplished amazing things here in Ontario. It's been the fastest tool for our deep decarbonization. So for me, it's common sense. It's very misunderstood, but maybe you're sensing the passion in my words. This is why, I'm always fighting for the underdog. And strangely enough, it's this misunderstood.
The nuclear
technology.
power organizations are an underdog as far as Chris Keefer is concerned. That's fascinating. I understand that one of the arguments you're making is that electrical cars are a big solution, but we just can't power them if we don't have a lot more electricity. And the best way to get the electricity is nuclear energy.
Right. So, we talk a lot about the need to electrify everything in order to achieve, our best possible chance at staying below 1.5 degrees centigrade, or fundamentally just taking climate action. Now, we use a lot of fossil fuels for things like heating and transportation, especially being a big country like Canada with large distances between cities, a lot of commuting, et cetera. So that energy needs to shift from petroleum to electricity, which means we need to increase the size of our grid. We need to double or triple that, which is
triple the size of the grid.
Yeah, which is mind-boggling. That's a huge amount of electricity to add. And if we truly electrify everything, that means we remove that fossil infrastructure. We don't have, gasoline stations anymore. We don't have diesel backup generators anymore, right? And so if we're going to electrify everything, we need to get a lot more power on the grid. And fundamentally, that power needs to be ultra reliable. Because if the grid goes down and everything has been electrified, then my ventilators and dialysis machines stop working at my hospital. The water treatment plant goes down. You turn on the tap, there's no water. Your sewage doesn't get treated. You can't charge your phone. Your lights don't go on. So nuclear is the only deep decarbonization technology that can underpin that kind of a grid and provide that kind of reliability that we all need.
So what was the reaction in Glasgow?
Well, I had a very interesting interaction with our new Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Mr. Stephen Guilbeault. Who, as your listeners may or may not know, is a former environmentalist. He was head of Greenpeace here in Canada. I shouldn't say head. He was very involved in Greenpeace for 10 years, as well as a number of other environmental nonprofits. Basically, every chance he got, he opposed nuclear energy. So I think it's pretty fair to call him, an activist with an anti-nuclear record at least. So he was speaking at a talk called, that was put on, partially sponsored by the Canadian Labour Congress, called Powering Through a Coal Phase Out with a Just Transition for Workers. And I just found it so ironic. Here's a man who's been so opposed to nuclear energy, again, that delivered us the greatest greenhouse gas reduction measure in North America, that delivered a just transition for coal plant workers into nuclear plants. And here he is, kind of virtue signaling. And it struck me as a great hypocrisy. So I managed to
what do you mean virtue signaling?
I mean, maybe that's an incorrect word, but I mean, to be there with that record of opposing the very tools that delivered our coal phase out and our just transition, and to be talking about, taking some credit. I think there's a new just transition policy that's been passed by the federal government. To me, it's a little bit substanceless if we're not actually talking about the technologies that can deliver us there in a time when we're really having to look at our options and what works and what does not. So I had an interaction with Mr. Guilbeault where I asked him, again, based on the scientific consensus, these 4 principal decarbonization pathways that call for an increase in nuclear energy, like, has that caused you to reevaluate your previous consistent anti-nuclear position? Is that going to cloud your judgment as minister of this, crucial file? And he was very much unable to answer the question. It was very sort of typical evasive maneuvers of a politician, and it ended up. I had a friend there who was taping it, and it ended up going viral on Twitter and led to stories in the National Post, the Montreal Gazette, the Edmonton Journal, the Toronto Star. It really exploded in the Canadian media, and I think has really created a space for this much needed conversation to occur.
What about the balance of the world? What other kind of reactions did you get other than just from the Canadian government?
So we're living an interesting time, right? We're both in a climate crisis, but also an energy crisis right now. So you've probably heard that fossil fuel prices are going crazy around the world, that there's shortages of natural gas and coal. Europe has made itself incredibly dependent on Russian gas. They built a lot of, weather dependent renewables, and they've hooked themselves up, mainlining Russian gas, essentially. It's been a very interesting year in Europe. They've had an extreme weather event, not a cyclone, not a tornado. It's actually a lack of wind. They call it a wind drought. Excuse me. And that's led to a real decrease in the amount of wind electricity that's being produced. It's down 20-30%. At the same time, they had a harsh winter last year. They didn't fill up their gas reserves. So prices spiked about 1,000%. And it's
1,000%.
10 times price compared to last year.
We're talking about, gas
Unreal.
over $1, but and we're being shocked.
Yeah. No, this would be as if the price of a barrel of oil went to $300 a barrel. That's the equivalent. And what you'll see is that despite Europe having much stronger carbon taxes, in the order of $100, $150 a ton, they're burning coal because even with the carbon tax on top of the coal, it's cheaper than gas, which is a huge step backwards on climate, obviously. When fossil fuel prices go up, nuclear starts looking very attractive. And we're seeing that in Europe. So the UK recently changed one of their laws to enable financing of nuclear power plants. And, they had a historic investment announcement in terms of investing in Rolls-Royce, who are building a new generation of reactors. The French president, Emmanuel Macron, has committed to building 6 new large EPR reactors, as well as developing an SMR for export. So this is
what's EPR and SMR?
So EPR, it's basically the French or the European large pressurized water reactor. And an SMR is a small modular reactor, so a reactor with a smaller power output. The French are seeing that as a potential opportunity for an export business, but they're focusing on delivering that abundant energy that they'll need to decarbonize their grid, to electrify everything, and to avoid being dependent on Russian gas. So that's very interesting. There's climate considerations, there's just transition considerations, and there's very much geopolitical considerations. And Europe's really living that moment. So around the world, nuclear is definitely on the agenda again. I'd say most importantly, although China didn't have a pavilion at COP, they announced a historic investment of $440 billion to build 150 large-sized reactors.
150 large
150,
reactors. And they're one of the only other countries that's using CANDU technology, are they not?
They do have some CANDU reactors. It's interesting. I mean, they've had a bit of a buffet approach to nuclear. Yeah, the Chinese have taken a very sort of buffet approach to nuclear. They've sampled the world's nuclear technologies, and now they've settled in on their own indigenous design, what's called the Hualong reactor. That's the story of nuclear buildouts around the world, is that you standardize a design, you get really good at building it, you get the production experience, and the costs come down dramatically. And so, like in South Korea, for instance, nuclear has been cheaper than coal to build, that's what we need to decarbonize the world.
Cheaper than coal to build.
Yes. I mean, that's partially because South Korea is functionally an island because of its neighbor to the north. It imports coal. Coal's a little more expensive, but for them, yes, nuclear energy cheaper than coal. And we can achieve that with the right conditions. And that does involve some degree of government support, especially signaling to private capital that this is a good investment, that it's a secure investment, so we can de-risk it. So instead of the cost of interest being 9-10%, it can come down to 2 or 3%. We can take advantage of these historic low interest rates to build a clean energy infrastructure which lasts for 60, 70, 80 years and can lock in effective, quick, and deep decarbonization.
We're chatting tonight with Chris Kiefer, who is the president of Canadians for Nuclear Energy. He's also a physician, an emergency room physician. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Chris in just a second. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio, where we're on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Chris Keefer. He is an emergency room physician, a lecturer at the University of Toronto Medical School, and he is president of Canadians for Nuclear Energy. He was recently in Glasgow at COP26, and he's telling us a little bit about, number one, the argument for nuclear power and why anti-nuclear activists have been successful in the past and have argued against it, and that he thinks is a mistake. And he's also been telling us a little bit about what the reaction, both from Canadian government, the new minister of the environment, and the world has been to the idea of nuclear energy. I wonder, Chris, what you think about some of the other solutions. We've talked a little bit about wind and solar. What about hydrogen, ammonia, some of the other solutions that people are talking about? Aren't they better than the potential waste you get from nuclear?
Well, they're important solutions, but what I'll tell you is those are energy storage mediums. They're not energy generation mediums. So making hydrogen is incredibly energy intensive. It's a way to store energy. It's essential. I mean, we need hydrogen, particularly for the production of fertilizer, upon which so much of the world's food supply depends upon. But it's not a source of electricity. And I think that's a real misconception people have. Similarly with ammonia. So, these are tools. There's definitely hard to decarbonize sectors. Electricity is actually the easiest thing to decarbonize. But when we start talking about cement, steel, fertilizer, they become quite difficult. So yes, these are absolutely important adjuncts, but you need a source of energy, for instance, to hydrolyze hydrogen, to create that as a fuel. And nuclear actually pairs incredibly well with that, because cracking that water molecule into hydrogen happens better at a higher temperature, which can be delivered by nuclear as well as the electricity needed to do that process. So these are, as I said, important adjuncts, but they're not a replacement for nuclear energy.
The world has really turned off nuclear energy in the past decade, 2 decades. It was something that people talked about a lot, probably a generation ago, but a lot less. And I think because of anti-nuclear waste activists that you've talked about, potentially about some of the accidents, do you think there's any chance that you're going to be able to have an impact and change sort of this trajectory?
I absolutely think I will. It's interesting. You talked about that some people have called it a nuclear renaissance in the early 2000s. It's interesting just to think about why that happened and how that's perhaps similar to the conditions we're living in at the moment. So you'll remember there was a lot of anxiety about peak oil as, the price of a barrel of oil, I think it went over $140 at some point in the early 2000s. And as I said, whenever fossil fuel prices go very high, nuclear gets on the agenda, again, because it can actually replace the services that fossil fuels give us, which are, again, quite attractive. They're portable, they're abundant, they're easy to use. But when they get expensive, we start thinking about nuclear. What killed that nuclear renaissance? A big part of it was the fracking revolution, right? All of a sudden, gas and even shale oil became dirt cheap and made an environment in which nuclear had a very hard time competing in. Another element was definitely Fukushima, and we addressed that a little bit earlier in the show. And the third thing is that the Western nuclear industries, they hadn't built anything new in 20 or 30 years. And they were very obsessed with the idea that we could solve that issue and build things well in the West simply by coming up with a fancy new design. And that's, I think, something I'm seeing right now that I find a little bit troubling, is our focus again on the idea that a new design is going to save us. Right now in Ontario, we're having the country's largest infrastructure project, which is the refurbishment or life extension of our CANDU reactor fleet at Bruce and Darlington. So the CANDU is designed for a 30 to 40 year lifespan with a midlife refurbishment, I should say, at 30 or 40 years. So these reactors can go 60, 70, 80 years with that midlife refurbishment, which involves swapping out the major components of the reactor. And so, there's been a real abandonment of this idea that we can use CANDU technology. We've got a huge supply chain leverage. We've got tons of skilled workers that are intimately familiar with everything involved. We're replacing major components in a lot of these plants. Now is the time not just to keep the refurbishment going and refurbish actually Pickering, which is not being refurbished, but also I think to build new CANDU 6s, which is a design we're familiar with. The Western nuclear industry, in my opinion, has to be very humble. Right? We haven't built anything in a long time. We need to stick with what we're good at, and we need to stick with something that has that 96% Canadian supply chain that enables Canadian prosperity.
So if you were the Minister of the Environment, or Premier of Ontario and responsible for infrastructure investment and the provision of power, what would you do?
Well, as we've been saying, we need to triple the capacity of the grid, and we need to do that with an ultra reliable resource.
So we have building a whole bunch of nuclear reactors in Ontario.
Well, first thing first, the most urgent thing is to save and refurbish the Pickering nuclear generating station, which provides the baseload electricity needs for the entire city of Toronto on the footprint of a small shopping mall. This plant it was supposed to be refurbished. There was an approval done by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. The environmental assessment passed with flying colors. But rather than doing that in the early 2000s, we elected alternatively to do a massive wind and solar build out, which, in a grid that's already ultra low carbon, it doesn't deliver much bang for its buck. Unfortunately, wind, for instance, which we invested a huge amount in, it produces radically out of phase with demand in Ontario. So, you might notice those spring and fall gusts are pretty intense, but on a hot summer, humid day in Toronto, when you would, pray to the weather gods for a breath of fresh air, a little bit of wind, it's absent. So during our peak demand, that energy doesn't show up. We end up curtailing a lot of it or selling it at negative prices, basically giving it away for free to the US. So it's a huge misinvestment. We should have taken that money and invested it in the refurbishment of this Pickering plant, and we'd have another 30, 40 years of ultra low carbon, ultra reliable, air pollution free electricity. But we did not. So we need to make up for that error now and save this piece of critical clean energy infrastructure. Just the closure of that one plant is going to eliminate 1/3 of all the emissions progress we've made since our peak in 2007 in Canadian emissions. It's extraordinary.
The elimination of Pickering would eliminate 1/3 of all the emissions benefits that we've gained since 2007.
And we have to face it, Canada's not done a good job in terms of, compared to its G7 neighbors, at reducing its emissions. We've come down by about 22 megatons. Closing Pickering and replacing it with gas, which is what the IESO confirms will happen, will raise that by 8 megatons. So yeah, the math is pretty simple. This is a huge step backwards. No one's talking about it. Climate activists, clean air activists should be up in arms, but also labor should as well. This is a plant that supports 7,600 full-time equivalent jobs, 3,000 of them directly at the plant. So, on so many different areas, on climate, on clean air, on labor, on Canadian prosperity, nuclear is a clear winner. So, what would I do? I would refurbish that plant. I would, potentially even take dramatic action. Like the federal government bought a pipeline, right? They spent $4.5 billion on the TMX pipeline. They bailed out the Muskrat Falls hydro project in Newfoundland to the tune of $5 billion. They own in the Hibernia oil fields. There is a precedent for the federal government to get involved and steer energy policy. So this is way out of left field. I'm throwing open the Overton window here, but I would make a strong case that the federal government should buy an equity stake in Pickering, just as Bruce Power did recently, issuing a green bond. I think something similar could happen to entice private capital to come in at low interest rates and get that refurbishment done. That's just to maintain the progress we've made so far. But of course, yes, we need to build new CANDU. We're very good at doing it. It's delivered well. We have an evidence base that it works very well. We need to 3x our grid. That really involves something like adding 2 more Bruce power stations to Ontario. And I'll just remind you, those are the largest operating nuclear plants in the world at Bruce Power.
So you're saying the federal government's got to get involved. You're saying the provincial government's got to build in Pickering, and the federal government should put equity in. Issue a green bond, do the refurbishment, and I presume the province of Ontario should build 2 new nuclear power plants. Is that politically saleable?
Well, I practice an aspirational politics. I'm not a windsock. I don't go to focus groups for policy suggestions. I like to look at what the problem is, the true scale of it, figure out what will work, and then build a political consensus around it. Right. So I know these ideas seem way out of left field, although there is a precedent. Mr. Guilbeault, your government bought a pipeline. Right. These things are doable. If we're truly in a climate emergency, we need to do more than just, give people a $5,000 rebate for buying a luxury Tesla vehicle. We need to get serious about the actual solutions. And we need to decide if, as a society, we're willing to make those historic investments.
But do you think any of the current political parties would actually go forward with what you're recommending and risk getting elected or defeated on it?
it's going to take time. I'm not naive, right? But we're working every day to spread this message and to put these ideas out there. And I'm glad to be getting quite a lot of coverage actually now in the Canadian media, both in print journalism, talk radio, and television, to spread these ideas. And I think these ideas are going to spread well because they're logical. You know, they're strong arguments, and the anti-nuclear position is just so dogmatic. It's so tired. Forgive me for saying, but it's so boomer. You know, people are ready for these new ideas, and we're very concerned, as we should be, about climate change. I mean, look what's happened.
It's so dogmatic. It's so boomer. What do you mean by
that? You know, look at what's happening in BC with the heat dome this summer. And now with these catastrophic floods. I mean, Vancouver is cut off from the rest of the country. That vital trade artery has been severed. You know, we need to take drastic action. The government needs to get creative. And we need to act as if we're actually in an emergency. And so what I've outlined for you, it's outlandish policy. But I think by putting it out there, I make it more available. And again, extend that Overton window in terms of what's acceptable. And, you know, I think politicians are really warming up to it. I've had some very interesting discussions.
The Ontario government.
What's that, sorry?
Have you presented to the Ontario government? You said you mentioned it to the Minister of the Environment federally. What about the Ontario government? Because that's the one that's responsible for power here in Ontario.
Exactly. They do have that profile, though. As I was saying, the federal government, there's a precedent for them getting involved in energy. Absolutely. Let's say it's an ongoing process. We have engaged with several political parties. You know, our slogan is the best climate policies belong in every party. So we're absolutely pan-partisan, and there is support in all the parties. You know, Andrew Weaver of the former Green Party president in British Columbia signed on to our open letter, which is boldly pro-nuclear. We've had support from retired Liberal, Conservative, and NDP politicians throughout Canada. So there is the potential for a consensus around a solid, sound policy.
Are there organizations like yours in the United States or elsewhere around the world?
There are pro-nuclear organizations. There's a campaign for a green nuclear deal in the United States that's engaged in a similar policy battle. And similarly, they're doing a lot to try and save some of their nuclear power plants that are at risk or at risk of closure. You know, there's a key metric called the carbon abatement cost. How much do we need to spend to keep a ton of CO2 out of the atmosphere, right? And it's a great objective measure by which to decide on what our priorities are. And, you know, in New England, where one of these studies was done, saving an at-risk nuclear plant from political closure was $25 a ton. Putting rooftop solar on a house was $800 a ton. So we need to get past all of the feel good, you know, it's natural, it's good, or it's nuclear, it's scary, and just start looking objectively. We don't have the time to sort of pick a pet technology. We need to have clear objectives and metrics, and then make the policy decisions that will get us there based on sound past evidence.
I understand that one of the reasons why the Ontario government or Hydro, whatever the organization was, Hydro Ontario, at one point in time was thinking about circling Toronto with a whole bunch of gas-fired plants. And the reason why was because there was a fair amount of leakage of electric power when you transmitted electricity over a long distance. And that didn't go ahead because of political opposition about having power plants, gas-fired power plants close to residential areas in Oakville and Toronto and et cetera. Would you be building these nuclear power plants close to cities, or would they be way up on the Bruce Peninsula?
Well, you know, that gas plant story is very interesting. You're right, to some degree. Several communities fought off those gas plants. You know, that turned into a multi-billion-dollar scandal, as you know, basically political considerations meant that the Liberal government of the time canceled those contracts as they were half built. And interestingly, you know, the strongest anti-nuclear group in the province, called the Ontario Clean Air Alliance, actually was suggesting that the government use gas to phase out coal instead of air pollutions-free nuclear energy, and went so far as to actually lecture those Oakville residents fighting that natural gas plant to say, hey, the smokestack's high enough, it's better to produce electricity where it's being used. In terms of nuclear, I mean, Pickering is very interesting. It's quite close to the city. I went out there. They have a nice beach and a kind of marina area, tourist area. And on the beach, you can get 300 meters from one of those nuclear reactors. And people are just swimming there, enjoying their day. There's a suburb 500 meters from the station. People, you know, who live next to nuclear tend to really like it because of the amazing jobs that it provides, and because it doesn't have any downsides in terms of air pollution or other problems next to, you know, related to living next to an industrial site. I think Pickering thinking, as a station, it's got a lot of transmission infrastructure right there. To abandon that station would be hugely foolish. It plugs in nicely, as you were saying, into the local grid infrastructure. And we'd probably need to build some gas plants on that east end of Toronto to replace it, just to, again, balance the grid. But yeah, I mean, nuclear stations like Bruce, it's built quite a ways away from the city, and you can transmit it in. So in terms of where new nuclear is sited, there was a proposal at the old Nanticoke coal plant on the Huron, on Lake Huron as well. I think it's several hundred kilometers south of Bruce, to turn that into a nuclear facility, build some CANDUs there. That was back, I believe, in 2007, 2008. So, we've made these propositions before. There was a plan to build 4 CANDU reactors in Alberta in 2012. This is possible, right? But you're right, it will require a change in political will. And I'm really hoping that the advocacy that I'm involved with will educate Canadians and make them demand, evidence-based climate action from their political leaders.
Fascinating conversation. Really appreciate it. If people want to follow you or check you out or criticize you, what's the best way to contact you and stay in touch?
Yeah, well, I'm open to all of the above. I love constructive conversation and debate. The website for my group is www.c4ne.ca. So c4ne.ca. And you can follow me on Twitter at Dr_Kiefer, Keef as in France, ER.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate your telling us a little bit about nuclear energy, about COP26, about your advocacy for more nuclear energy in Canada, and particularly the refurbishment of Pickering, which is an issue that I wasn't aware of. And so good luck, and thank you for sharing this with us. That's our show for tonight, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm on every Monday through Friday on 9:60 a.m. at 6 p.m. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca. You get all my podcasts and videocasts on briancrombie.com. Videos are on Facebook, on Instagram, on LinkedIn, and podcasts are on Apple, Audible, and Speakeasy. Thanks for joining us. Dr. Chris Keefer, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.